Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to see everyone who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform. It's been 10 years of the war, and today's day 617 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor. And I want to thank the representatives of all the mass media who tell the world the truth about our heroic resistance. Today we have invited you for a presentation of a very important list, a list of persons suspected of persecution of Crimean journalists and bloggers. The Crimean Human Rights Group and ZMINA Human Rights Center put together the list of such people, which will be presented to us in part. Joining us in this studio are Olga Skrypnyk, head of the Crimean Human Rights Group. Also joining us is Iryna Sedova, researcher at Crimean Human Rights Group, and Victoria Nesterenko, project manager at ZMINA Human Rights Center. Good afternoon. So, Ms. Iryna, let's talk about this list. Who is on the list and what were the crimes of those people researched and studied? And I would like to ask a technical team to put the list on the screen. Well, today is an important day. Today we commemorate the stopping of impunity of crimes against journalists. The journalists and bloggers are persecuted by Russian occupiers since the beginning of occupation of Crimea. They use different ways to do it, like psychological pressure, intimidation, and horrible tortures, illegal detention, illegal arrests, failure to provide medical aid, and we document all these crimes since the moment of establishment of our organization. In 2015 we worked with our colleagues in ZMINA and we tried to collect as much information as possible on these issues, and after the beginning of the full-scale invasion we reinforced this work, not because the number of repressions intensified, because we want to seek satisfaction. We want everybody guilty of those crimes to be brought to liability and punished, because such criminals are numerous. And now that we have an opportunity in coordination with Coalition 5 AM Ukraine to summarize all this information, to put it into to arrange it in one database, it turned out that there are 15 Crimean journalists now which are held in captivity by Russian occupiers, and we've collected evidences for those 15, more than 90 criminals that are involved in persecution and inhuman behavior in relation to those journalists. And those criminals, I mean, this list, it includes both high-level officials and high-ranking officers in the rank of colonels or lieutenant colonels, along with the employees of the places of detention who just allow themselves that inhumane behavior in relation to our journalists, and they remain impune. So we decided to make a part of this list public so that the society sees the names of those people, so we can seek sanctions imposed against them, because a part of those criminals are already sanctioned, which was due to our work, because we seek imposition of sanctions on them on the international level. But those 10 people whom I would like to focus on today, they are not sanctioned for the time being. They are not on the sanction list. However, in our opinion, they deserve such a just punishment and to be added to the sanction list, because those people, they are not only directly involved in persecution of those journalists, but they were guiding those processes. For example, that there is a deputy head of investigation department of FSB in Crimea. He was involved in organization of investigation department which was fabricating the cases against the journalists detained in Crimea, who were held in captivity further on with long prison sentences against them. Also, there were prosecutors who were supposed to observe the compliance with the human rights. For example, if people were tortured during those persecutions, the prosecutors were supposed to submit to the court for such tortures. But in Crimea, they do exactly the opposite. For example, in case of Iryna Danilovich, she is in terrible condition in a colony. She is deprived of medical aid. My colleague Victoria will tell us in more detail about Iryna Danilovich case. And Hanna Tromova is a person involved in persecution of Iryna Danilovich, and she is also involved in other cases, the cases of saboteurs, Crimean Muslims. And just in the same way, the judges in Crimea, Crimean judges, they show up on a number of cases initiated by us. For example, Alexander Mordovin, a judge of Court of Appeals of Russian Federation. So who is supposed to consider appeals when the lawyers submit complaints about the improper awards of the courts? So he could cancel those illegal awards, but it's only formal. In fact, Alexander Mordovin is just a part of this torture and persecution machine of Russian Federation, and he does exactly the opposite. With his own hands, he was signing those court awards like those awards, they are of legal force, and thereupon the imprisoned journalists are being deported to the colonies in Russian Federation, which is against the international humanitarian law. It's a terrible deportation, and those are being deported, specifically the journalists who cannot be staying there even pursuant to the laws of Russian Federation. For example, Ahmed Suleimanov is a person with a heart disease, and he's not supposed to be in prison in general, but after the court sentence, he was deported. Within a month, he was transported from Crimea to a colony in Russian Federation. And those prisoners, they were telling us about the way they were transported in railway cars, wooden railway cars, and they stay in small cells. They can be transported for a number of days in those railway cars and then put in a confinement cell without mattresses, without linens. Like, people are ill, they have diseases, and they are being deported to those colonies with terrible conditions as well. And also present on our criminals list, apart from persecutors and judges, are the representatives of medical institutions, the medical institutions that work with the Federal Law Enforcement Service. And those people, they are called doctors, but they in fact are not doctors but criminals. And they are in the ranks of colonels and majors of internal service, and they are just guilty for turning the blind eye against those crimes, or they order the nurses who work with the colonies not to provide the prisoners with the medical aid, and it's considered a type of tortures. Also, there are representatives of expert units of FSB who are directly involved in fabrication of the criminal cases. For example, they make an expert opinion that expressions, the statements of people constituted some illegal cause or something like that. Also, there are minor criminals, like petty criminals, but they are the direct executors of those crimes. For example, we have Sergei Makhnev on our list, who takes part in the fabrication of the criminal cases since the beginning of large-scale persecution. So he mostly deals with the case of Crimean Muslims and all the civilian and civil journalists of Crimean Solidarity who are imprisoned under fabricated cases is merit of this person, which remains impune. And we also demand the sanctions to be imposed on him, no matter that he is not a head of a unit or a person of similar level. There are also heads of the directors of the confinement cells who take part in creation of inhumane conditions where the Crimean prisoners are held. For example, Serhiy Berezhny, we seek sanctions to be imposed against him as well. We continue this work and we call everybody who has any evidences, any documents, because all those documents, even if they seem unimportant, they make one single mosaic, one puzzle that can be laid as a foundation for initiation of criminal cases against those people. We have already handed over those documents to the law enforcement agencies, and any additional documents will be of help to law enforcement because the scale of crime is so big that law enforcement system cannot deal with all of them. This is why the help of the civil society is very important here. Thank you very much, Victoria. So let's stop at the specific cases. What do we know? So since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, ZMINA documented 142 cases of attacks and threats against journalists, against online editorials, and it constituted the suppression of freedom of speech and all persecution of journalists, pressure over the journalist, threat, intimidation, illegal sentences, abduction. They are all components of this big problem in Crimea, which constitutes a violation of right to freedom. And one of the mechanisms of the pressure over the journalists who are imprisoned in Crimea and in Russia is failure to provide medical aid, because among our Crimean prisoners there are people who have serious chronic diseases, who are disabled, who got those diseases while being imprisoned, and their health conditions seriously deteriorated. Among them are journalists, for example, Iryna Sedova, who, even being in the confinement cell in Simferopol, she experienced at least one or a number of strokes. She was complaining about her health condition deterioration. There was no single time she would have been provided medical aid, no matter that the human rights activists and her family, they brought that issue up, and as a result she lost hearing in one of her ears, and then she was deported to Russia, and over there, thanks to the pressure of the law of the human rights activists, she underwent a number of testing, like CAT test, and those tests confirmed the deterioration of her health condition. Also among the journalists there is Ahmed Suleimanov. Like Iryna has already said, he has a heart disease, he is in need of surgery, but in the same way he was under home arrest for a prolonged period. Then he was imprisoned and deported to Russian Federation. However, pursuant to the laws of Russian Federation, those diseases that he has will make him exempt from imprisonment. So talking about the failure to provide medical aid in compliance with the international laws, international humanitarian law, it can constitute a torture. So we document all those crimes, we collect information about the people who are involved in persecution of political prisoners, and specifically failure to provide medical aid to them. So in coordination with the Crimean human rights group, we created a sanction list that we handed over to our law enforcement agencies and international institutions, to the countries of European Union and United States. And today is the only way we can influence this situation, because as we analyze all those cases of political prisoners, specifically those who were deprived of medical aid, and if we deem it as one of the mechanisms of pressure and application of tortures, it's a systemic policy of Russian Federation. And on top of that, we see that the political prisoners are being more and more deported to Russian Federation, so that the lawyers, human rights activists, families don't have access to them, because when a political prisoner is in Crimea, the families and the activists of Crimean Solidarity, they have at least a hope that they can influence the situation. Because failure to provide medical aid is when a political prisoner complains about deterioration of his health condition and he is refused a visit to doctor, and the handover of medicines is prohibited from families or their lawyers, or otherwise their medicines are being taken away during deportation, and as they come to a new place of imprisonment, those medicines are not provided to them either, because they're just not available or due to some other fabricated reasons. So deportation and failure to provide medical aid or refuse to provide medical aid is something we want to draw attention to, because it's been a long time that there were no exchanges, and sanctions list is one way that we can influence this situation. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Olga. We see this list, it's more than 90 persons on this list. So what is the further fate of this list that you were able to put together? And also we would like to talk about the ways, the tools to bring those perpetrators to liability. Thank you, Olga. We want to thank everybody who joins us either online or in this studio. We want to thank all the journalists who continue fulfilling their professional duties under fire of MLRS, under the bullet fire. It's very important to communicate this information about the crimes of Russian Federation. It's our colleagues who help us to corroborate all the crimes committed by Russian Federation, and I also want to thank all the journalists who took up the arms to defend our country in the ranks of the armed forces. So first attacks on our journalists started in 2014, right after the occupation of Crimea. Russia targeted all of the media that existed there. They attacked them physically, like they were beating people, they were pillaging their offices. It all started in February 2014, and me and Iryna Sedova are the witnesses of those events. She was in Yalta and I was in Kerch back then. So it was a conscious policy, intended policy. It was not like a random crime. This is the systemic policy of Russian Federation, and all of the levels of any occupational power are built into this policy. So starting with the regular policeman, so-called Center A, which tortures journalists because they use the administrative law of Russian Federation for illegal searches. So any post on social media is a reason for Center A to search you, seize all of the computers, phones, and fabricate a criminal case, which results in a 15 to 17 years prison sentence. now there is a phenomena of civil journalists is emerging, because everybody who was working with Ukrainian media, they were persecuted or their activity was directly prohibited, as well as their entrance to Crimea. So since those years, the journalism in Crimea is represented by civil journalists who consciously disclose the truth, which is punished by Russia by fabricating cases against Ukrainian and Tatar journalists, the cases that my colleagues mentioned about. And it's not only a violation of Ukrainian law against our citizens, but it constitutes an international crime. Dozens of types of crime, including illegal deportation, illegal arrest, torture. Basically, all of the journalists became victims of the tortures. They were all experiencing psychological violence, and no single person within the period of occupation of Crimea, both FSB and policemen, none of them was brought to liability for tortures, beating, and so on and so forth. It's the impuned system, impuned for the representatives of occupational authorities, and those horrors are about to continue. In fact, we don't have a lot of tools, but still some are available to us, and very frequently publicity is one of such tools. What's important is that all people who are victims of terror, that their names are known. Today we have one mechanism related to the prisoners of war, and even that mechanism unfortunately has its complications. We see that some processes are currently suspended. When we talk about the civils, such procedures don't even exist. We only have some ad hoc cases when Russia was adding civil hostages to the exchanges. And talking about Crimean political prisoners, including the journalists, it's a huge problem, because so far we don't have any single tool to set our citizens free, because Russia considers Crimea their territory and they don't even enter into any negotiations. But we continue working, we continue handing over the lists of journalists, political prisoners, and our way is to find countries that can be engaged in conversations. One way or another, sooner or later, such window of opportunity is about to appear. So it's important for us to have a documented list of people who were illegally imprisoned, and this is what Crimean Human Rights Group and ZMINA is getting involved in, and I incredibly appreciate the input of everybody who helps us put together this complete puzzle about our hostages. And talking about the people involved in crime, they are the people who are supposed to be brought to criminal liability, there are two blocks of work. First, it's a criminal liability itself, and first of all, it's liability on the Ukrainian level. Ukrainian law enforcement agencies are supposed to bring them to liability upon proper investigation of the cases. We understand that physically it's not quite possible, but one day we expect to get access to the territory where we can arrest those persons. And yet another part is the coordination with the law enforcement agencies of Autonomous Republic of Crimea and Sevastopol. Regarding all of the journalists, there are criminal cases opened where they are victims of the crime, and we also handed over the list of people who are involved in those crimes of freedom deprivation, illegal arrests. And after year 22, we have intensified our work. We have a working group that works on crimes against journalists. We handed over that list to them as well, and now we are about to hand over the expanded list to them. On the website of Crimean Human Rights Group, you can find a separate section which is called Crimean Cases, and over there you may find this information online, which is constantly updated regarding those who are currently behind the bars, and there is also a specific section about those who are involved in those cases, all the FSB servicemen, all the judges, all the prosecutors. As we identify them, we add them to the database, and we continue getting feedback from Ukrainian prosecutors, from Ukrainian security service, who also investigate those crimes. And I'm happy about having this work coordinated, because during years 14, 15, 16 it was almost unreal to seek investigation of such crimes. Now this work is in progress, and Ukraine has all legal reasons for detention and bringing to liability of those perpetrators. But again, it's always that information is not sufficient, so anybody who has any information about crimes committed in the territory of occupied Crimea or other occupied territories, please contact law enforcement agencies. It's very important to identify both perpetrators and the victims behind the bars. Yet another level is international level of investigation, and my colleagues handed over the information to the International Criminal Court, but we understand that now all the attention of ICC is focused on the crimes that were committed after the 24th of February, but we, the organizations of Ukraine 5 AM Coalition, we submitted an appeal to make sure that those cases that were before the February 2022 don't fall beyond the attention of the ICC. It's about EU, Canada, USA to be aware of those crimes, to make sure that they know what's going on in Crimea, that people suffer there. And there are two levels of sanctions: international sanctions approved on the level of European Union, or country-specific sanctions. And recently there was a parliamentary summit of Crimean platform in Prague, and the colleagues from Crimea SOS, they met the representatives of the government of Czech Republic and handed over the lists of people involved. Just last week I was visiting Brussels, where we stated our suggestions about the new sanction lists, and we included people who persecute the journalists or intentionally don't provide medical aid because it results in death of our citizens. Just 2 of our citizens died since the beginning of this year. So for us, sanction list is a way to make this problem public on an international level. And again, we call all of our partner countries to continue this work, because it's of great importance to us. And basically those are the main tools that we use. And there's yet another very important issue, which is not of lesser importance than the others, is the fact that those perpetrators are supposed to be brought to liability, and the Russian Federation is supposed to compensate all the harm done to us, including our journalists, because some of them are imprisoned since 2014. We have 2 international documents for the time being. One is of a United Nations organization level, and another at EU level, about the creation of mechanisms of compensation against crimes, against harm of Russian Federation inflicted by Russian Federation on Ukraine. But those documents don't include Crimea. They are only related to the crimes committed after February 2022. So those who are behind the bars for the time being, they are not entitled to any such compensation. This is why we want to ask our partner countries to develop a mechanism which would include all of the harm inflicted by Russia since 2014, since occupation of the Crimean Peninsula. We can see all those horrors in the pictures put here on the walls in this studio, and hundreds of our people since 2014 have become victims of tortures, and they are fully entitled to compensation. And we want to seek Crimea to be included in all the compensatory mechanisms under which sooner or later Russia will pay what they're supposed to pay to its victims. Thank you very much. Thank you, dear colleagues. If you have any questions, please join our conversation now that you have the opportunity to ask your questions. Well, I see that we don't have questions on the floor, so I incredibly appreciate the work you're doing. We understand there is demand from our society, demand for justice, and to make sure all of the perpetrators, everybody who's guilty of this war, to be brought to liability. Thank you for your interest to this topic. We want to thank our security and defense forces to have opportunity to hold events like this. Glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.